Hi everyone, and welcome to Priority Zero, a lead dev engineering leadership podcast. I'm Scott Carey, and I'm your host today, and I am joined by Camille Fournier. Camille, thanks so much for joining us. Before we get started today, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and what you've been up to?
Sure, yes. So let's see about me. I live here in New York, so I'm very, very excited to be seeing you in person. You're here for the Lead Dev in New York conferences, which is great. I am an engineering executive, been doing it for a long time. So I was the CTO at Run the Runway quite some time ago. Then I've had leadership positions in finance for the last 7 or 8 years now. I'm also the author of a few books. The Manager's Path is the one that most people have heard of and know about. I have a new book coming out this fall on platform engineering as well. So very excited about that.
Amazing. And so the first thing that I always like to talk about on this podcast is just a little bit about how you got into software and engineering. Like, where did you find that spark? When did you realize that this is something you might want to do?
I've been into computers for a long time. You know, I'm old enough that wasn't a thing that everybody did when I was a child, but I was always interested in computers. I was lucky enough that my dad was a professor and we had access to both computers and, the very old internet in my house growing up. And so I sort of always was interested in that. I remember I installed like a Slackware on the computer that I built myself in high school, like that kind of thing. And I remember when I was going to college and trying to decide what I wanted to do, my grandmother said to me that, Camille, you like money. You like making money. And I'm looking at the US News and World Report's like top careers. And I can see that, technology and computers is a growing career field. You like computers anyway. Maybe you should go to college for computer science. And so I did. So I went to Carnegie Mellon for computer science and, kind of the rest is history.
Yeah, I love that piece of career advice, basically follow the money. Was that did that stick with you as you were going to college and as you were starting out in your career?
The overriding thing is that I do really like computers. I really genuinely enjoy technology. I love being in the tech industry or, being a technologist and the problems that show up in software engineering. I don't think that I would have lasted if I didn't have that just sort of foundational interest in it. Yeah. The fact that it has turned out to be a lucrative career is honestly great. My grandmother was wise. I think I'm much happier doing this than I would have been even, other alternatives being things like becoming a lawyer or, becoming a professor or, something like that. So I do think it's turned out very well for me. I would not say go into tech just for the money because I actually think if you don't like what you're doing at all, it's a real grind. So I do really enjoy it. The fact that it, pays well certainly helps.
Yeah, I think a lot of people do, especially in recent times, not recent times, but over the last decade have probably got into tech because they've seen that that's where the money is. And you saw the rise of boot camps. You saw the rise of the self-taught developer, the YouTube developer, and all of that. And I do think that I'm not a developer, but I talk to a lot of them. And I think that what a lot of the early experience of being a junior developer is butting your head against the wall over and over again. A lot of software development, it's got better over time, but a lot of it is repetition and pain and trying to solve these problems. And I think if you don't have an interest in that or an underlying passion for it, the money is not going to make up for that. It's just going to be too hard, right?
Yeah, no, it's a hard field. I do think that, one of the reasons it is lucrative and I think will probably remain relatively lucrative is that it's just not that easy to be really good at it. Even from a management perspective, right? I do have a relatively firm belief that most managers of engineers, the best tend to have been engineers, right? Now, I do know people who were not engineers who are very, solid, good, even great managers of engineers. I think they tend to be the exception to the rule. And, I think for most people, having had that background of some kind of hands-on technology experience for a number of years, just makes them better, particularly when you are managing the more sort of technical, deeply technical types of engineering areas, either, real expertise in mobile, real expertise in, platforms, which is what I do, distributed systems, right? I think it can be hard to be very successful if you don't have kind of that credibility, and you haven't gone through it. You make better decisions when you have some concept of like what is hard about the job.
Yeah, and your career is quite interesting because like you started out in like the startups world that ended up being a fashion company that in that startups world, and then you went into finance. And I feel like in the startups world, you typically have, engineer founders, a lot of engineers that kind of move up through the ranks, like, or they go in at like VP level, but it's not really VP level because you're the only manager. Whereas obviously when you go and work in finance, like these are big, broad organizations where you might have a few more like non-engineering leaders. Is that the experience that you've seen?
Well, yes. And to be clear, I did not start in startups. So I worked at Microsoft for a hot second. I went to graduate school and I worked at Goldman Sachs for a good 6.5 years before I did the startup thing. So actually, I will say, yes, like that, I think one of the things that helped me write the manager's path and made me a good engineering manager and able to kind of think about it was having seen a company where you had a lot of professionalism in the management ranks in the technology teams. And so, there were of course ups and downs as with every company, but like I had seen and I'd gotten some minor amount of like training on things like how to write performance reviews. And, I wasn't coming in completely new to the idea of management at all, or having never seen it done, reasonably to very well, depending on who you were looking at. So, but I do agree that like startups have the advantage of you get to kind of decide how you want to do it, which I think can be great.
There's a but coming.
Well, the founder mode thing is like the topic du jour. I guess kudos where they're due, even though I found the original blog post super like thin.
Was this Brian Chesky?
Well, the original blog post is Paul Graham, PG.
Oh, yeah.
But like it was, Brian Chesky was giving the talk and that was what inspired the blog post. And look, so I think that every great company is constantly reinventing the way it does things. And I think the idea that only startups do that is just totally naive. Like
100%.
It just makes me feel like, have you ever worked for a really successful big company? Because yes, there are, at any giant company, anything at scale, right? You're going to have people that are better and worse. And, you're going to have those, lying senior executives that they talk about in that blog post. But like, I've never actually worked for a big company, and I've worked for some very big companies that wasn't in fact like, did not have success partly because they had senior leadership that cared about details, that like had this weird idea that, oh, you just create these boxes and they're just these black boxes and you delegate and you don't care or pay attention. Like, no, like successful big companies, people are absolutely paying attention. They are delegating by necessity, but that there is a difference between, delegating between having experts running around and between this just strange straw man of like manager mode where, it's all about some 50-year-old idea of what like professional management is like, which I don't think is a true experience.
Of course, to take some like tech examples, like you've got Meta being called Meta, like that's a pivot. Like everyone at the moment is pivoting to AI for good or bad. But like if your company is not pivoting, then you're not pivoting, and then that always falls to the manager to translate that, right?
And you think things just change, and people change the way that they operate. I think companies are always learning. Good companies are always learning how to do things better. And I suppose if you take one, the good thing should be if you're building a company and you're in a startup and you're trying to build it, you're trying to make it better and better and better over time, you are always going to be reinventing what you do and the way you do things. And that is the only way you go from, successful small startup to successful big company. And that, it may be in your product, that may be in the way you actually run the company. But plenty of professional managers do that. Like a good professional manager still cares, still has opinions about things, still is challenging themselves and their teams to do better and deliver more. And, and I just don't think that that's actually a skill that only founders possess or only founder-led companies possess.
Yeah, and for anyone not watching this, listening to it, there's a certain amount of air quotes going on whenever you say professional manager. But I do think it's a really interesting topic in that, you talked about when you're a startup or a scale-up, you do get, as a manager, a certain amount of scope to kind of do it the way you want to do it, and then you kind of like build on that, and you more process comes in. Obviously, you said you worked at Microsoft and Goldman, where probably things are a little bit more set in stone when you walk in there. But when you say professional manager, do you just mean process bureaucracy, or is there more to it?
I mean, I think that when people use, like, when I think the way that term was sort of like written about in the blog post we're discussing, it's sort of this like stereotypical idea of these, almost like, frankly, professional BSers, right? Yeah. These people who's like, they're just really good at managing up and, telling you what you want to hear and doing whatever they want. And look, of course, those people exist, but the idea that there aren't great managers who learned the skill of management at a big company, who take the job seriously, but who also are, deep experts in technology or design or whatever, right? Like, it's just not true. It's just it's like this strange flattening stereotype of the way the world works. The world, there is plenty of bureaucracy at big companies.
Yeah.
And some of it is unavoidable. I think when you can't just have like these dictatorial decisions and make people feel good. Like, that's actually, I think everybody really understands, like, this sort of command and control. You have this hierarchy of management that just tells people what to do and the layers below just follow it. Is a passé idea since Drucker was writing about knowledge workers, ages and ages and ages ago. Like, so that's not really the way successful companies ever work. Bureaucracy does sometimes come up because when you have a lot of opinionated people and you can't really just do this command and control, you need different ways of creating consensus. And sometimes that does turn into a bit of bureaucracy in committees. And I do agree that, like, taken too far, that can be very tiresome and that can slow a company down, maybe stifle innovation. Yeah. But, understanding why that happens and where it comes from, and then being creative about how to counteract it, I think is, one of the interesting challenges of managing at scale.
Yeah, I've never seen a company try the true bottom-up, like, decide by consensus actually work. Like, especially, as you said, people are opinionated. Engineers in particular can be pretty opinionated. There's got to be someone that makes that call eventually, right? Yeah,
there's got to be someone that makes a call eventually, but it is important that you figure out when and how to make sure people feel like they are being heard, that they have some autonomy and ownership of the right things, right? The right levels of decision. And, you're just not going to be able to control everything. Again, as you scale, as a company grows, smart leaders know there is absolutely no hope for controlling everything. So you've got to be, smart about where you really put your time and attention and focus and the details that you spend a lot of time. And this is not just the CEO or the C-level executives. Like, this is senior people at all levels need to figure out how to do this, particularly at large organizations. And, you got to know what's okay to just like, look, let's see how this plays out. Yes, we need some amount of accountability measures, check-ins, business reviews, metrics, whatever, that you're going to kind of use to make sure things aren't going completely off the rails. But, that balance, you've just got to constantly be figuring that out.
Yeah. And you mentioned, like, good managers. Like, what are the qualities of good managers that you see?
I mean, I think good managers are, right. That's a big question. Let me take a minute. So I think good managers are not afraid to have hard conversations. Is actually one of the top things. I think, look, there are a lot of managers out there who are successful and are afraid of having hard conversations. So that you will not necessarily be unsuccessful without this trait, but I think it's very hard to be really good at the management part of the job, right? If you are not willing to disappoint people sometimes, if you're not willing to listen carefully to what someone's saying to you and, be able to respond to them in a way that is maybe not what they want to hear, but it at least reflects an understanding of where they're coming from. I do think good managers care about outcomes, but they also care about methods of getting to those outcomes, right? If you're only about, outcomes and you're willing to tolerate toxic individuals or, rule breaking, law breaking, that will catch up to you over time. It'll make it hard to retain good people. It may implode your business depending on how bad the laws are that you break. May get you thrown in jail.
Actual laws.
Yeah. So I do think a good manager cares about outcomes. Absolutely. And cares about means of getting to those outcomes in a balanced way, right? I think you see problems is too much of one or the other, right? Too much about the outcomes, or in some sense, sometimes too much about how did we get there, and either, is it super consensus driven, or does everybody feel happy, or, have I protected everyone's feelings too much, or am I too risk averse sometimes, right? You do need to take some risks in business or you'll never get anywhere. That's not the same thing as saying break laws. That's not the same thing as saying turn a blind eye to, bad behavior. But, that may be look, we're going to take a risk of a project that may not succeed, or we're going to do something that this other team may get mad about because they really think that they should do it and we shouldn't. Sometimes you will need to take risks like that because the right outcome is, involves some hard feelings.
Yeah, I think having a balanced peer group is something that maybe people don't spend enough time thinking about. And when you look at the really successful organizations cross industries, there tends to be this balance, but most often between co-founders, where you've got an optimist and a pessimist, and they kind of end up helping each other out. I think that in your management layer, it's good to have a mix of those people. Yeah. I was reading an interview with one of the founders of Lansdowne, which is a fund manager in London. And he was, self-recognized as the pessimist. And then his co-founder was the optimist. And they would just always balance each other out, which in fund management is super important.
Yeah.
Because you want to make those big bets, but you also need to manage that risk. So it's always good to kind of try and be aware of that and hire for it accordingly, or reorg accordingly.
Yeah.
Going back to you, when did you realize that you wanted to go down the management path yourself?
I stayed very hands-on for a number of years.
What's your specialism?
Distributed systems. Yeah. Distributed systems is what I still love. I'm still very passionate about. I think for me, what I decided, and the advice I give pretty much everyone, is you should really stay hands-on until you feel like you've kind of mastered some part of, you never master everything in technology, but mastered some area pretty well. And that you're not necessarily going to learn a lot more by staying in this, that you're going to get kind of some diminishing returns of learning new skills. And for me, so I felt like I had kind of reached this level of look, there's always more to learn. You're never done learning. But, I was getting a little bit more toward the diminishing returns of, learning about doing big hands-on projects. And I could see that a lot of the problems I wanted to solve were human and process related in a way that wasn't just about the technical decisions. And I thought, I want to try management. I want to try I want to try being in that role where I have responsibility to people and technology and delivery. So, I decided I wanted to try that. I did it a little bit, at Goldman, but not very much. I never could quite find the right opportunity there. And so then I went to startups, and that was really where I was I want to be in a management job. I want to be on a management track here. And so that's where I kind of ended up really, really developing and growing as a manager.
Yeah. Do you feel like you have more scope to learn how to do it in that environment than you might have at Goldman?
Yeah, I think more scope, different scope. I mean, making every mistake yourself without the net of like HR or training or like a bunch of experienced people around you to tell you, to advise you, like it's scary. And if you get through it, you can learn a lot very quickly.
Yeah.
But you can make some big mistakes. I've definitely made some big mistakes in the going through the process of doing that. Which I think I've spoken about at lead dev conferences in the past, that, I famously was told at some point that I had created a culture of fear on my engineering team. And that was a real wake-up call for me that I needed to work on my approach to communication and to accountability and make it much less sort of judgmental and scary, frankly.
Did you kind of learn that from others? Like, is that because that was the environment that you came up in?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, a little bit. I mean, different company culture, different companies that have a culture. There's definitely, companies with a culture of like, it's okay to yell at people. I think that's much less true now than it was when I first started out. Like I definitely think nowadays it's just very frowned upon, but that was not the case when I was early in my career. And so I definitely learned a little bit of like, oh, well, this is, if somebody screwed up, it's okay to like really let them know that they screwed up. Yeah. And so I had to unlearn things like that.
I don't hear about it so much anymore. There's like one tech company that I'm not going to say that always pops into my head. But then like in the UK, we have a newspaper called the Daily Mail. And I've had friends that have worked there, and that is famously a culture where like back in the day, your copy would literally be thrown back at you and you would be showered with some expletives. And I don't know what it's like now, but like that was always the culture that I heard about, and they exist. Those kind of environments exist, but yeah, few and far between now.
Again, I think the world has evolved in mostly positive ways over the last 20 years. Companies have evolved. The expectation, the tech industry has evolved, right? I think, I've worked in finance a lot. So I've been a technologist, but in finance companies. And there's a lot more professionalism, I think, still to this day in finance companies. Again, they still sometimes would have behavioral problems. It wasn't certainly not all, roses and ponies, but like, it's a more professionalized, just an older industry. And, it's already had a lot of scandals and lawsuits and regulation and all these things sort of pushed on it. So you get a little bit more of that professionalism in those kinds of big, really well-established. I mean, probably IBM is the same way. I've never worked there. Right?
Sure.
So I do think, I think things are in general better. I know probably people listening to this are like, are you kidding me? But there's all these bad things. And it's like, yeah, but like, trust me, the stories we could tell, those of us could tell, particularly women in tech could tell about the industry 20 years ago. It was a much worse place than it is now. And I think it's great that we've made such good progress.
Hey folks, Scott here. I just wanted to interrupt this episode for 10 seconds to tell you all about LDX3 London, a festival of engineering leadership on June 15th to 16th, 2025. We're going to be bringing together 2,000 engineers across all levels for 3 stages and 2 days, and Camille herself is going to be speaking at that event. Tickets are available now at leaddev.com/leaddev-London. Now back to the show.
Yeah, and you wrote The Manager's Path in...
I think it came out in 2017. So it came out, I wrote it starting in 2015, I think.
Okay, yeah, so we're coming up to 10 years. And like at Lead Dev, we talk about this a lot, where like The Manager's Path, and there was a bunch of other kind of writing at the time that kind of really marked this like line in the sand with, especially with tech, of like what you're talking about, which is this professionalization of management. Like it obviously existed. There obviously were managers in tech, but I don't think anyone had really kind of codified like what it looked like and what like the difference between that and being hands-on was. Like there was just all this work being done in terms of like what management in tech looks like, your book being like kind of a big piece of that. Like the question is like, now that the industry is going through another big shift where, teams are getting smaller, there's less money flying around, you can't do everything, you have to be more picky. There's a big prioritization drive. Like, do you feel like the stuff in your book has dated now because the world has changed?
I mean, I hope not.
Yeah.
Look, like I wrote that book on the back of startup life that like I have never personally, may not be quite the right term, but my career has actually mostly not been in hyper growth periods within companies. Like different companies go through different hyper growth periods. So even though as an industry as a whole, we've grown a lot over the last 20, 25, 30 years, like, it hits companies at different periods of time. I tend to come in and tend to be in towards the tail end of growth, and often sometimes even in shrinking, cleaning up what happened. Right now, I did oversee a reasonable amount of growth at Rent the Runway, but even that was not like hyper growth. It wasn't like I grew the team from 15 to 500. I grew the team from like 15 to like, I don't know, 65, right? Yeah. And so I don't actually, like, feel like I've ever worked in an environment where I have been lousy with, resources, with people, with money. Some people who know me may think, Camille, you're crazy. Like, I want you to like review the places you've worked recently and ask yourself if that's true. But look, the truth of the matter is, like, I have overseen a lot of situations where I've come in, the team has mostly not grown or even shrunk, and I've been the one to make sure that we're doing as much, if not more, with the people that we have, instead of tearing our hair out and being like, we can't possibly do anything because you're not giving us 20% more people year over year over year.
Yeah.
And so nothing about my management philosophy requires hyper growth or constant scaling, with the exception of, in general, you don't really get promoted as a manager if you aren't overseeing larger numbers of people. Mm-hmm. And nothing I can do about that, though. Like that, but I mean, people still get promoted at companies that aren't necessarily growing because people leave and teams get reorganized. And so, like, I wouldn't worry about, I guess, I don't know. I don't think my advice is irrelevant because of that. However, I do worry that people will think, this is only a book for like the coddled few that can spend all of their time thinking about, people. And I just think you haven't read my book if that's what you think it's about, because my book is a lot about getting things done and about creating environments in which people are able to ultimately serve the needs of the business, which is to deliver things and to grow and to create value. I have never been a person who is about management for the sake of making people happy. I spent too many years at Goldman Sachs to not care about what they always called like commercial mindset. Like, what's the value of what we're delivering? How are we, what is the most important thing to be focusing on to grow this business, or to, what's the priority problems to be solving for right now? And how are you aligning yourself, aligning your team, aligning your strategy, aligning your plans to doing that? I am super passionate about that. Like that, I just happen to think that you will be more successful doing that if you have the right management structures in place, because, a lot of the time, you have one manager overseeing 50 people. Look, if you're what's his name? Jansen. Exactly. If you're the NVIDIA CEO, like you've got, even he says, like, look, these are executives. Like, I can have 50 executives reporting to me and I don't need to meet with them one-on-one because they're freaking executives. Yeah. Right. And that there is a huge difference between, yes, being a CEO overseeing a bunch of like very senior executives, mm-hmm, and being a mid-level manager overseeing ICs or junior managers. You need different amounts of time with people depending on the maturity and the scope of who it is you're overseeing. And so, I think there's a risk that people just love to be like, oh, here's the magic solution to all my problems. The magic solution to my problems is I have 2 managers. Let's get rid of all the managers and make sure they're all managing 20 to 50 people. I think you're just going to have different problems, right? I think I do worry a little bit that in parts of the industry, we're in the, I will rephrase this as the fooling around stage, and we're going to be coming to the finding out stage, in the next year or two, potentially, if we don't, if we let this continue to go on, this, really massive swing back in the direction of like management doesn't matter. Yeah. Because reframe it in your own mind. Management is not about like touchy-feely people shit. It is about getting things done. It is about running an effective organization that is focused, that is delivering important things. And yes, that has people that come to work ready to give their best. That is what great management is. And if you can hear that and say, but I don't really want that, like, I don't think that's valuable. Okay. All right.
If you can do that in a human and empathetic way, which you absolutely can, then you're kind of like, you're kind of cracking the code, aren't you?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think by what you're saying about like people taking lessons from these kind of snippets that you hear, like Jensen has 50 line managers, or you've got these kind of like life hack people on YouTube, and people like that seems to be the way that people want to get on with things. Like that is not going to be sustainable. Like that is not the way. It's adaptable to your organization. You've got to take the good, take the bad, and figure out how it works for you.
Exactly. If founder mode means anything, it really should just mean there is no formula.
Yeah, be adaptable.
There's no formula to running a company. And by the way, that applies to the CEOs and companies as big as, IBM or whatever, as it does to your startup. It's not about founder mode. It's about you move and you evolve or you die.
Yeah.
So don't be afraid to move and evolve. But, there's not going to be one formula for your company that is the same as everybody else's.
IBM could have maybe evolved a bit more. But
yes. Yeah. But they're still around. So,
no shots, but kind of shots. So you've got a new book out, which is very different. Tell us a bit about that.
Yes. So I have a book on platform engineering, which is what I've been doing actually sort of more as like my focus area ever since I left Trent Runway.
A much misunderstood term in my experience.
Yes. I mean, look, part of the reason, so I co-wrote this book with my friend Ian Noland, who worked with me at 2 Sigma, was an SVP at Datadog. So look, as I said, my technical expertise is distributed systems, right? And platform engineering is really, the way we're talking about it in the book is really about, the sort of developing and operating of internal technology that delivers business leverage, that is sort of built with the users in mind. You can't just like build stuff and be like, now you have to use this. It's actually about like, how do you take a product mindset to helping the overall company be more productive.
When you say users, you mean engineers, right?
Yeah, engineers usually, yes, yeah. And really delivering leverage to the business, like making the business ultimately like more successful because you have the right people focused on solving this problem for everyone, rather than every single team kind of half-heartedly solving it for themselves.
I think like we're just now starting to see the real fallout, and I've been kind of waiting to see this of the like 2 Pizza team, Amazon stuff of like, okay, like that works in an environment where you do have a huge amount of like cheap money flying around. You can hire to solve problems. You can get everyone doing two pizza teams to solve problems, but then you end up with like all this crazy overlap. And now Amazon, we're seeing with their new CEO, Amazon Web Services with their new CEO, are starting to shut stuff down that isn't that popular, and it's getting people annoyed. But you have to do that as a business. You have to focus.
Yep.
And I think finding those repeatable artifacts or those platforms that people don't have to like. Well, Amazon literally invented undifferentiated heavy lifting, so let's do less of that.
Yeah.
I do think people are finally starting to come around to the value of that.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think a lot of what we saw happen was like you had the cloud and you had open source, both grew really rapidly. The cloud was sold to a lot of people as like, oh, like just like give your engineers the cloud. And you don't need teams that are experts in this. You can just like give them the cloud. Yeah. And, open source kind of also encouraged this, pick exactly the right tool for the job. And here's the source code. You can run it yourself. It's no big deal. This is all great. Which, like, look, I am a huge fan of both of those innovations. I think they have done amazing things for the industry. I think, though, what you find when you say go nuts is that, okay, like every team does their own little thing. And over time, they start to slow down more and more because all of those little things have to be maintained. They have to be updated. Often you have to write all this glue code that, sort of keeps it all together, that ties the application to the infrastructure, to the open source. And, that stuff all has to like evolve as you find security issues. You want to upgrade your libraries, whatever. Amazon's forcing you to upgrade EKS on a pretty rapid clip. Yeah. And that can be a lot of work depending on, what you did with it. And so, I think there's this idea that the cloud itself, for example, is a platform. I just don't think that's actually true, particularly if you're talking, again, platform engineering is not something that is for like a tiny startup. No. This is really like when you're starting to get to some amount of scale, when you're really starting to see either a lot of sort of duplicative work and overlap, or you're starting to see systems that really need like expert focus attention to be able to scale and operate for your business. And maybe you need a bespoke storage system or something really for your business. Like this is for that kind of situation, not tiny startups. And we talk about this in the book. But what we want people to realize is, if you've been around for long enough, you may have gotten burned by bad central teams where they were like, here's the thing, you have to use it. You didn't like it. Often they didn't operate it all that well. It was like, and the cloud was like, oh, I can just do it myself and I don't have to deal with this central bureaucracy and I don't have to, coordinate and this will be great. So one of the, a couple of major points we make about platform engineering is it's only better than those bad old days if, number one, you take a product approach, meaning that you actually listen and build what people need and want rather than what your engineers think they should have or think would be cool to build, right? Because that's a huge problem with platform and sort of central infrastructure teams, even those that call themselves platform engineering today, that they just kind of do whatever they want. And they get this reputation of building tech for tech's sake or whatever.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is that you will have to operate those systems to a very high standard, right? So I think sometimes you get teams that are like, maybe they're building things that people want, but then they just don't operate them well. And you're like, what are you doing? You're providing critical infrastructure for this company, but it's not reliable. And so now everybody's getting dragged down because they can't debug anything without pulling your team in. And your team doesn't really want to be on call on the weekend, but like, hey, this is a 24/7 business. What are we doing here, right? So I think, I do think like platform engineering, it's important to differentiate it from old central teams because I think the companies that kept those central teams but actually made it work, they, implicitly or explicitly like kept these lessons of like, it's not just that we're building software for software's sake. We're actually building things that this company needs, that the business needs. It's going to support, developers more on the product or application engineering side. And we are going to be experts at operating those systems as well. I think those, and it's not just, we're buying vendor stuff and gluing it together. There's actually some software engineering that happens because that's really the glue that's the more value add glue. Like I think, software eats the world because software can really create meaningful leverage, but it means you need software engineers who are going to take a little bit of a creative approach to solving these problems.
I think that becomes like quite a useful incentive actually, because I remember talking to some engineers at Yelp who were like really going hard on the platform engineering side. And there was like their kind of approach, like in a nutshell, was like, as a platform team, we're going to build golden paths. And if you don't want to follow that golden path and you feel really strongly about it and you want to go off it, then you're going to operate it yourself. And you have to operate that to these standards.
Yes.
And if you don't, then you're coming back on the golden path. There are going to be consequences. So make sure that you are dead serious that your way is better than our way.
Yes. Actually, I think that's one thing that platform teams sometimes miss because they want to be like, well, we'll build this library that's like useful, or we'll package this software, but you operate it yourselves. And it's like, no, a big part of the way you deliver that business leverage, you deliver that productivity, you deliver that value is by being the operator of the software and, being the operator of the system, dealing with, making sure it's reliable and scalable. That's actually a lot of where the value comes from. This is not just about building cool libraries and then giving them to people and saying, cool, like we built this library, we built this framework, it's awesome. It was just a useful thing. Don't get me wrong. Like sometimes that's part of the job, but it's not as much of a value add as when you're actually operating it for them.
Yeah. And I always ask people, what is your priority zero right now? I think for you in particular, it's a really interesting question because you're not in a role at the moment.
Yes.
So what is your biggest priority?
Well, I mean, I suppose right now, my biggest priority is probably getting people excited about my upcoming book. Yeah. But I figured I would talk about how I recently left a job. And so I've now left sort of executive level jobs a few times. So I've actually gone through that process, which, not necessarily something that people go through a lot in their careers. And I've learned something about doing that I thought may be useful to the audience, which is like, okay, you've decided to leave a job, you're leaving a job, you're in a senior role where you've got some notice period that's probably longer than a couple of weeks. Maybe, you're giving them 3 months or, a month, but you're giving them some amount of time. What are you supposed to do? What should you do or not do there? What is your priority? Because this was something I had to learn kind of the hard way, which is your priority is to try to set your team up for success as much as possible, but it's not to make decisions about what will happen next. And I think that is not always intuitive to people. It certainly wasn't to me anyway. Meaning that like you may think like, well, I'm doing good work here and I've decided to leave. And surely they want me to tell them like my successor should be this person and here's how you should set it up. And, this is what's this is what success will look like. And, the reality is the minute that you're decided to leave, you are no longer in the decision. You can advise, you can guide, you can make recommendations, but you're not the decider. And if you get really hung up, and in particular, if you give your team the impression that you're still the decider, they are likely to get very frustrated and disappointed because inevitably the person that is, the executive that was managing you or the CEO or whomever, they're going to have their own ideas. And, it's probably a reason you're leaving, right? Is that you have some differences of opinion, maybe, or, maybe not, but, they're an independent thinker. You're an independent thinker. They're going to have their own ideas and they are likely to be somewhat different than what you think. And you might be right, but it does not matter because it is not your decision anymore. Yeah. So I think if you want, your priority zero when you are leaving a senior job, you've got some time of, transition where you want to leave on really good terms, is to make sure you are really internalizing and externalizing, making sure your whole team really understands, I am not the decider on what happens next. I can advise, I can counsel, I'm happy to give you some mentoring or some advice. I'm happy to, make my recommendations, but you've got to understand this is this other person's decision now, and you will be happier. Like everyone will be a little bit happier if they realize that you are no longer in that job.
Learning to let go
and being very open about the fact that you were letting go. And then I guess the other priority is like, don't stick around so long that whatever lingering bitterness you may have had, because we all have something we don't like about our jobs, starts to come out and people start to like use you as like the person to like bring all their negativity to, and then you start to reflect it because of course you have a little bit of your own lingering negativity about this, that, and the other. And then that is always just like that's a bad scene. It's a bad scene for everyone. It does nobody any good. Letting go of any negativity and being like, look, I'm not here to like talk shit about this person or that person. I'm just here to, I'm here to like make this transition smooth. And the minute that it really seems like I don't need to be around, it's probably time for me to start to log off.
Yeah, a friend of mine who works in insurance told me recently that some senior people in insurance have notice periods of 24 months, which I think is the most insane thing I've ever heard in my life.
Wow. That's a lot.
Hoping you get a good chunk of that as gardening leave for them. But like imagine trying to like navigate that period of time. Right, Camille, we are at time. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I'm really excited to see what you do next. We always end on a recommendation. Is there anything you've seen, read, listened to that you want to recommend?
Yeah, well, I read a lot of fiction. So I read Long Island Compromise last week at the beach. It's a novel. It's a woman author, Taffy, Brodesser-Akner, I think.
Yeah, she's British, I think. No, British.
No, she's American. Well,
she is American, and she writes these amazing celebrity profiles.
Yeah, she was a journalist, and maybe still is. But she also has started writing novels. So she wrote. Her last novel was Fleischman is in Trouble, which is also an amazing show. If you've never seen it, Claire Danes gives one of the best TV performances I've ever seen in my life. But she has a new novel out. It is polarizing. Not everybody loved it, but I thought it was fantastic. I loved it. So, that's my recommendation.
Love it. Great recommendation. Camille, thanks again. Really excited to see what you do next and see you again soon.
Yes. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you again for listening to Priority Zero, a Lead Dev podcast. Remember, you can get us wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, but when you do, please remember to like and subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and we hope to see you at the next one.